Okay, let's unpack this. We're going to dive into one of the most powerful and, maybe one of the most overlooked groups in medieval history,
The Hanseatic League.
the Hanseatic League. And it's so interesting because it's hard to get a handle on what it even was. It wasn't a kingdom or an empire.
Not at all. It was more like well, think of it like a giant corporation run by a bunch of cities. It's a surprisingly modern idea, really.
So it all gets started back in the 12th century. You have these merchants, right? And they're trying to move goods across seas full of pirates.
And land full of unpredictable local lords who might just decide your cargo is now their cargo.
Right. There was no one looking out for them.
So they decided to look out for themselves. The word Hansa just meant a group of merchants traveling together for safety.
But it grew into something so much bigger than just a safety squad.
Oh, way bigger. They realized that if they worked together, they could do more than just fight off pirates. They could set the rules. They could negotiate with kings.
They basically built an empire of trade. Not with armies, but with the threat of
what?
cutting off the supply chain.
Exactly. They controlled the flow of goods, and that gave them immense power.
So if it's this huge network, there has to be a center. And that's the city of Lubeck, which everyone calls the mother of the Hanseatic League. Why Lubeck?
It's all about geography. I mean, just look at it on a map.
Okay.
Lubeck is in the perfect spot. It's this little land bridge between the North Sea and the Baltic Sea.
Ah, so it's a choke point.
The ultimate choke point. If
Yeah.
you wanted to move goods between the resources of the East and the markets of the West, you pretty much had to go through them,
And that means they could collect tolls and taxes on almost everything.
which made them incredibly wealthy and powerful. And that's why they organized the big meetings there, the Hanseatic.
The Hanseatic. So that was like their version of a parliament.
Sort of, yeah. It was a big economic summit. Representatives from all the member cities would come to Lubeck to settle disputes, make new rules, that sort of thing.
And Lubeck also established a common legal system, right? Lubeck law. Why was that so important?
Well, think about it. If you're a merchant, the last thing you want is 50 different sets of rules and 50 different courts run by some local baron. It's too risky.
You want predictability.
You want predictability. Lubeck law provided that. Clear rules for contracts, for weights and measures. It just made long-distance trade safer and easier.
And all that wealth got poured back into the city. Strong walls, a big fleet of ships.
Stability and standardization. That was Lubeck's gift to the League.
Okay, so we know who they were and where they were based. What were they actually shipping around?
It was a very clever exchange, really. They took raw materials from the East.
So from places like Russia and the Baltic states.
Exactly. Places with huge forests and not a lot of development yet. They were pulling out massive amounts of timber.
For building ships and houses in the West.
And also things like fur for warm clothes and beeswax.
For candles.
For candles, yeah. Churches needed a ton of it.
And what was going back the other way? What did the East get in return?
Finished goods. Things they couldn't make themselves. High-quality cloth from Flanders was huge. Metalwork, wine from Germany.
But the biggest one, the one that fed entire cities, had to be grain, right?
Oh, absolutely. Grain was the oil of the Middle Ages. You had these massive growing cities in England and Flanders that couldn't possibly feed themselves.
So the League was shipping grain from the fertile fields in, say, Poland.
Yep, Poland, Prussia, and moving it west to keep those cities from starving. By controlling the food supply, they made themselves completely essential.
But there was one commodity that was even more valuable than grain. They called it white gold.
Salt.
Salt. It seems so basic to us now, but why was it so incredibly important back then?
Because there was no refrigeration. Salt was the only way to preserve food, especially fish.
And fish was a huge part of the diet.
A massive part. The herring migrations in the North Sea were a huge source of protein for all of Europe. But that fish is worthless if it rots before you can get it to market inland.
So you need salt.
Yeah.
Lots of it.
Tons of it. And the League controlled the whole process. They controlled the major salt mines in northern Germany, and they controlled the ships that moved it all. It was a total monopoly.
Which let them keep prices high.
And profits even higher. That monopoly on salt is what made so many of those Hanseatic cities unbelievably rich.
Okay, so their whole operation depends on the ships. Let's talk about their famous ship, the Cog.
The Cog was a masterpiece of purpose-built engineering. It wasn't fast, it wasn't pretty,
But it could carry a ton of cargo.
An incredible amount. It had this deep, wide body and a single huge square sail. It was basically a floating warehouse.
And it had a flat bottom, which I find really interesting. You'd think that would be unstable on the open sea.
It could be, but it was perfect for their needs. A lot of the ports they used, like London or Bruges, were on shallow rivers or had big tides.
So a normal deep-keeled ship would get stuck.
Right. But a flat-bottomed cog could just sail right in, and at low tide, it would sit flat on the mud, which made loading and unloading way easier.
Super practical. And they had to defend all that valuable cargo.
They did. That's why they had those high wooden platforms, the castles, on the front and back.
To give their archers a height advantage against pirates.
Exactly. It was a cargo ship that could double as a floating fort.
So we have the cities, the goods, the ships.
Yeah.
How did they manage this whole global operation? What was it like in one of their overseas offices?
Well, first, the cities themselves were built for business. You'd see these tall, skinny brick warehouses everywhere, built to get goods off the ships and into storage as fast as possible.
And the merchants had to be pretty sharp, I imagine.
Oh, absolutely. You couldn't be a Hanseatic merchant if you couldn't read, write, and do complex math. Education was everything. They were training a class of professional international businessmen.
And they set up these special trading posts in other countries, the contour.
Yes, the four big ones were in London, Bruges, Bergen, and Novgorod. And these weren't just offices, they were like little self-contained Hanseatic colonies.
With really strict rules, right?
Incredibly strict. The merchants living there usually weren't allowed to get married, for instance.
Why not?
It was a business decision. The League didn't want its merchants developing local loyalties or starting families that might pull their focus or their money away from the League's interests.
Wow. Total dedication to the company.
It was all about keeping control and making sure the profits flowed back home.
And the main highway for all this trade was the Baltic Sea.
It had to be. Land travel was way too slow and dangerous. The sea was faster and you could move much more volume.
But the Baltic isn't exactly a calm, easy sea to sail.
No, it's famous for fog and storms and shallow spots. So the League invested a lot in making it safer. They created the first reliable sea charts of the area, built lighthouses.
But what about in the winter? The sea freezes over.
It does, and that just shut everything down. That was a physical limit they couldn't beat. But an even bigger problem was political.
The straits between Denmark and Sweden.
Exactly. The only way in or out of the Baltic, if a hostile king, usually the King of Denmark, decided to close that gateway.
The whole system grinds to a halt.
Which is why the League had its own navy. They fought several wars, especially with Denmark, for one reason and one reason only, to guarantee that those straits stayed open for their ships.
Which brings us to their political power. They weren't just a business group. They were a real force.
A huge force. They preferred to use economic warfare, though. Their favorite weapon was the embargo.
A trade blockade.
A complete trade blockade. Imagine the King of England decides to raise taxes on Hanseatic merchants. The League doesn't declare war.
They just stop trading with England.
They stop trading.
Right.
And suddenly, there's no timber for ships, no salt for fish. Maybe there are even grain shortages in London.
The king would have riots on his hands.
Precisely. It was a way of putting incredible pressure on rulers without firing a single shot. And it usually worked. The king would back down and sign a treaty that favored the League.
It sounds like they were unbeatable. So what happened? Why did this medieval superpower just fade away?
It wasn't one single thing. It was kind of a perfect storm of factors starting around the late 1400s. First, other countries started catching up.
Like England and the Netherlands.
Exactly. They started building better ships and their own merchant fleets. The League was no longer the only game in town.
And then the whole map of the world changed.
That's the second huge blow. Columbus, Vasco da Gama. Suddenly, the most exciting and profitable trade routes weren't in the Baltic anymore. They were across the Atlantic. The League's world became small.
So there was all this external pressure. Did they have internal problems too?
They did. Their strength was always their unity. But as cities like Lubeck and Danzig got richer, they started looking out for themselves more than for the group. They started competing with each other.
And the world around them was changing. Kings were getting more powerful.
That's the final nail in the coffin. The League worked best in a fragmented Europe of small states. Once you have powerful, unified nations like Sweden or Russia, they're going to protect their own merchants and build their own navies. An alliance of cities just couldn't compete with a whole nation-state.
And yet their legacy is still so visible. You can't say they just disappeared.
Not at all. You can literally see the wealth they created in the architecture of dozens of cities across Northern Europe, that signature red brick Gothic style. Many of those towns are still proud to call themselves Hanseatic cities.
And their ideas. Things like standardized laws for trade, working together across borders. That feels very modern.
It paved the way for modern international business. They proved that a group of people organized around commerce could be as powerful as any king.
They showed that if you control the flow of necessities, you don't always need an army. You just need a good ship and a solid contract.
And a little bit of salt.
So, something to think about. If the Hanseatic League was an empire built on controlling trade routes and essential goods, what modern organization or system holds that same kind of power today? Not through military might, but through economic control.
An excellent thought.
Good luck with your studies.